Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Making Waves, the show from the Chicago Maritime Museum all about our city's past and present on the waterways. I'm Madeline Crispell, the museum's curator, and with me, as always, is Sari Breslin, the museum's education director.
Thank you, Madeline. We have a very special treat today because our guest is Dr. Theodore Karamanski, a longtime member of the Chicago Maritime Museum's board and an expert in Great Lakes maritime history. Today, we're doing a deep dive into some of the questions we get most often from viewers of our show and from visitors to the museum about the long history of transportation and trade on the Great Lakes, how navigation changed over the years, and the days when Chicago was the busiest port in the country.
Like Sari said, joining us today is Theodore J. Karamanski, Ph.D., a professor emeritus of history and founder of the Public History program at Loyola University Chicago. He's served as a heritage consultant to the National Park Service, National Geographic, the History Channel, BBC, and the Travel Channel. He's written histories of Isle Royale National Park, Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore, and Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore. He is the author of 11 books, most recently 2020's Mastering the Inland Seas, How Lighthouses, Navigational Aids, and Harbors Transformed the Great Lakes and America. His book, Great Lake, An Unnatural History of Lake Michigan, will be out in late 2025, and we will certainly have him back to talk all about that. He is a founding board member of the Chicago Maritime Museum, and in 2022, he was awarded the American Historical Association's Award for Distinguished Contributions to the Field of Public History. A huge Making Waves welcome to Ted. Thank you very much for being here.
No, it's a pleasure to join you today.
So we have all different kinds of things that we want to make sure that we get to today, but I thought we might as well start chronologically, and I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about the indigenous communities that lived on and around the Great Lakes.
Well, the native people of the Great Lakes region, most of whom belong to a larger group called the Anishinaabe, they and their ancestors have been here since the very beginning. We go back thousands and thousands of years. 14,000 years ago.
Wow.
From the present, Native Americans are living on the shores of the Great Lakes, and those shores were being literally created while Native Americans were living here. As the glaciers melted and the Great Lakes grew in size. Over the years, sometimes the lakes changed, and so for a long time, Chicago was under the bottom of Lake Michigan. That's why it's so flat. But then later, the shoreline receded, and the shore of Lake Michigan would have been 100 miles from Chicago. But through all those changes, Native people were interacting with that environment.
Wow, that's so interesting. What kind of vessels were they using then on the Great Lakes and waterways?
Almost across the world, the first type of vessel used would have been a dugout canoe. And recently in Wisconsin, in Lake Mendota, they've discovered dugout canoes over 8,000 years old.
Wow.
But what's really unique to the Great Lakes region is the way the Anishinaabe harvested the forests that surround the Great Lakes to build what we know today as the birch bark canoe, which was really one of the great transportation inventions in history.
I think we have an image of one of these birch bark canoes that's in the Chicago Maritime Museum's collection as well.
I mean, they're fabulous creations because they so suited the environment of the Midwest, which is a very environment with lots of waterways, and also northern Canada, which is, of course, all sorts of interconnected lakes. And the great thing about the birch bark canoe was that it was a vessel that could be easily portaged. It didn't weigh a lot. you don't want to be portaging a dugout canoe.
Right, a whole log.
Yeah, made out of a tree log. No, this isn't going to happen. But by going ahead and using the bark off the birch tree, utilizing pitch to mend the seams that came from the forest, the roots of the trees to sew the edges together, and then finally cedar, which is a type of tree that's very common in the Great Lakes region. They were able to create these fabulous structures. You could have one as small as 8 to 10 feet for a single hunter or fisherman, or you could have one that was 40 feet long and could be used for a whole war party.
If someone doesn't know what portage a canoe means,
That's exactly the question I was going to ask next.
Could you just briefly explain
Though
what that
I'm
means?
sure our viewers at home have portaged many a canoe themselves over the years. Please, Ted.
Well, just for our Canadian friends out there, we'll call it a portage,
Lovely.
which is the way they insist on it. And after all, it's a term that comes from the French. But it's essentially when you needed to move from one waterway to another, you would carry your cargo and your canoe over a stretch of land that barred you from continuing by water. And of course, this was the reason Chicago developed as a city, was because you could take those birch bark canoes all the way through the Great Lakes, from Lake Ontario all the way to Chicago. But if you wanted to continue on to the Mississippi River system, which is the other great, waterway in North America, there was only a portage of maybe, a mile
Not bad.
that would go ahead and allow for that. And so over time, Chicago became a focus of transcontinental transportation.
So we've always been some kind of a transportation hub, is what I'm hearing.
Absolutely.
So, one of the questions that I think we get asked most often at the museum is when I tell my visitors, school groups, the people coming through, that Chicago at one point was the busiest port in the country, that's always surprising to them. Why not New York, New Orleans, San Diego, a city that's on an ocean or a body of water that's not landlocked, as some sometimes say about our region? Could you talk to us a little bit about, what made Chicago such an important port?
Well, New York was the busiest port for a lot of American history, but not always.
Not always.
And one of the reasons Chicago was busier than New York for a number of years in the 19th century was that there was a tremendous number of ships coming and going. New York probably had more overall cargo coming into it than Chicago at any point. But in terms of ships coming and going, Chicago had more than New York City. And so even as late as the early 20th century, Chicago was the fourth busiest port in the world.
Wow.
With only Hamburg and London and New York ahead of Chicago.
I think we also have a picture of busy Chicago port that you have supplied us. And what's going on here?
Well, this is one of the reasons Chicago could say it had more ships coming and going than anywhere else. And what you see here is a group of workers unloading lumber boards from a schooner. So this is wood that would have been harvested in northern Michigan and northern Wisconsin. Both of which in the 1880s were the most prolific producers of lumber in the world as on a state basis. And those ships would have taken maybe a day and a half to come down from Muskegon or from Manistee or from Green Bay. And they would unload their cargoes, and hundreds of workers would have thronged along the wharfs in Chicago because it was a lot of work to unload that lumber.
I can imagine. It looked like it in that photo.
Yeah.
And there was more lumber stored in Chicago than anywhere else on earth. The whole west side of the city was just filled with stacks and stacks of dimension lumber.
Now, some viewers familiar with the Great Chicago Fire may be interested to hear that we had these stacks and stacks of lumber, but I also understand that this kind of access to trade is part of why Chicago was able to rebuild so quickly after the fire. Could you tell us a little something about that?
Absolutely. And it's a remarkable thing that we have photographs of smoke rising from the ashes of the Chicago fire and ships coming in bringing lumber. There's sort of a myth in Chicago history that, well, after the fire we decided we're not going to rebuild the city in wood. No, people wanted to be sheltered from the weather right away.
Oh, yes.
And so they immediately began to rebuild with lumber. And indeed, you know, lumber was so prolific in Chicago as a building material that a type of construction was born in Chicago that has then spread throughout the world, and that's the balloon frame construction. And virtually all houses in Chicago are modeled on a balloon frame.
Interesting.
Wow, that's really interesting. And so the shipping didn't just come to Chicago, like the lumber that came from the Upper Peninsula and everything then was shipped down the Mississippi and through the Great Lakes everywhere?
Well, that's where, you know, there's people probably are more familiar with thinking of Chicago as a railroad center than thinking of it as a maritime center. But the key was the way the two worked together. So, yeah, the ships would bring the lumber to Chicago, and the railroad would bring it out to the treeless prairie, to Kansas, to Nebraska, to South Dakota, where the homesteaders were in the period, particularly after the Civil War. And the homes that they lived in was Great Lakes lumber. The barbed wire fences they built to go ahead and hold in their livestock, those fence posts came from the Great Lakes.
Well, you're welcome, guys. So you mentioned lumber as being one of these goods that's traded on the Great Lakes. What are some other things that are coming to Chicago during this period in the 19th century?
So we've got those farms getting set up out there on the prairie, and what are they doing? They're trying to grow grain, particularly wheat. And so the railroads are bringing that to the port of Chicago. And, of course, one of the things the farmers hate is they can't argue with the railroad about the rate that's going to be charged for getting their crop to market. And so they always hated the railroads for charging so much. But when the railroads got the grain to Chicago, all of a sudden there was now an alternative transportation route to get that grain. And so the railroads had to lower their rates because of the competition from the ships. So we have another photograph that...
The carpetbaggers and scallywags.
Oh, the railroad barons were the worst in the 19th century. But here we go ahead, and the tallest buildings in Chicago in the 19th century were grain elevators. And these were huge vertical warehouses where thousands and thousands of bushels of corn or wheat could be stored, and then, as you see in the photograph, they're loaded onto ships. So those ships would be sort of the long haul of Great Lakes sailing. They'd load up in Chicago, and they'd head out Lake Michigan, up to around Mackinac Island, down Lake Huron, across Lake Erie to Buffalo. Buffalo was the other place that had tremendous grain elevators because they would unload the grain there, and then it would be shipped via the Erie Canal to New York and to the world.
The reverse process that brought us the Chicago accent over the waters from Buffalo, New York as well.
That's right. You, when we were talking prior, you called the Great Lakes something that I've never heard before. Melting puddles, or what
Oh.
do you call that?
Melt ponds.
Melt ponds. Like, has anybody ever heard the Great Lakes called melt ponds? And then also, they were very different looking than what we know as today.
Right, because in the long glacial past,
Yeah.
there was this constant fluctuation as to how were the Great Lakes draining out through the St. Lawrence, or for a time they were draining through the Mississippi. And so
Okay.
the main outlet of the Great Lakes would have been down what we know today as the Des Plaines River Valley.
There you go.
But yeah, I mean, that's how the Great Lakes are created, is these mile-thick ice sheets moving across the landscape, gouging out from the softer subsoil, gouging out these giant troughs that become the lakes. Then as the glaciers retreat and melt, they fill up
Melt
with water.
puddles. We get melt puddles.
And of course, the Great Lakes are always changing. And so anybody who lives near the Great Lakes, particularly folks up on the North Shore, or have summer homes along the south and east end of the lake, they're always worried about, is the lake going to take away my summer home?
Oh, yeah.
Hey, Juneway Terrace Beach is no more in Rogers Park. It's just rocks now because of this process of change, right?
Wow. Yep. Always. And who worked? You said that there were lots of people that were employed. Who were the people that worked on the boats on Lake Michigan?
Yeah, I mean, the harbor was just a tremendous source of work, and this attracted people to come to Chicago. So you had people working up in those grain elevators, trimming because you don't want to have the grain all in one area and the building collapses. So you have to trim it out. And then there were the lumber shovers who were taking the lumber off the boats and loading it into the open air storage areas. And then, of course, there's the sailors themselves. All along where the Chicago River were boarding houses where sailors could stay in between their berths.
I think we have a picture of crews on a schooner.
Yeah, Great Lakes cruise were very interesting because they're in many ways mirroring the ethnic composition of the Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin frontier. And so you would find on those vessels immigrants from Germany, a lot of immigrants from Ireland, and even more so Scandinavians. Because a lot of the Scandinavians that came to Chicago in, say, the 1850s, they came directly from ports like Bergen, Norway, on vessels across the ocean, up the St. Lawrence, through the Great Lakes, and to Chicago. And so these were people who were skilled sailors.
Right. Cold water sailing, not too different.
They were used to it.
I think we have a picture that you might remember from a past episode, our Captain Schooneman, who was German, right?
Indeed. Yeah, the Schooneman brothers did not come to an happy end with the idea of, let's go ahead and stretch the sailing season to bring Christmas trees. And it ended tragically for them. But
Good hearts.
Good hearts.
Good hearts.
And this, of course, is, in the early 20th century, the tragedy of the Christmas tree ship. And it's at a time when these sailing ships were past their point of optimal use.
Sure.
By this time, we're getting, large 400, 500-foot steel vessels. And the schooners are just barely hanging on. And as a desperate measure to make a little bit money, they would make these tragic sailings.
So, Ted, we've only got a couple more minutes here of the show today, but, one of the questions I get asked most often, any age, people coming into the museum, how were these captains navigating on the Great Lakes? And I use my iPhone to take the CTA in Chicago. So how are people getting around?
I think we have a picture of
they didn't have cell
instrument.
service out on the lakes. And so the way they navigated was generally by dead reckoning, trying to measure how fast they were going using landmarks on shore. This is a key navigation aid for ocean-going vessels. It's a sextant, and it's used to go ahead and use measurements from the sun to determine your place in the sea. We only have one account of somebody using this on the Great Lakes. And he didn't use it very often because he was just going up to Green Bay. So they tended to do shorter voyages. They were very familiar with the landmarks along the way. And we also have another image of something that was very important for them. And those were very accurate charts that beginning in 1852, the United States Lake Survey was created. And this provided information on depth as well as an accurate accounting of the shore. Because for all sailors, the danger isn't the lake, the danger is the shore. And you want to know where the heck it is so you don't hit it.
Mm-hmm. And the lighthouses, how are the lighthouses aids to navigation?
Well, they were critical because they could be both day marks. You could spot one and know exactly where you were because of the color of the lighthouse, or at night, the color of the flash.
Oh, wow.
Well, this has just been spectacular, Ted. I mean, you've taken us through several millennia of Great Lakes history just now. It certainly won't be the last time we have you on the program to interrogate you with more of our questions. Certainly this fall, when your next book comes out, we'd love to have you again. But in the meantime, you'll just have to go get Inland Seas from your favorite library, branch, or independent bookstore and come down to the Chicago Maritime Museum anytime, Tuesday through Sunday, 10 to 4. Thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thank you. And thank you.
Especially
You're very welcome.
thank you, Ted, for
Yes.
joining us.
Thank you so much. We could have talked all day.